Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're going to get started up here. It's good to see all of you. Welcome to the Memorial Art Gallery's auditorium for tonight's conversation. I'm John Osp. I'm the gallery director for the College of Art and Design at RIT, and I'm thrilled to be introducing our guests this evening in conversation. This is part of the College of Art and Design's Anna Ballarian Visiting Artist series. I just first want to extend a heartfelt thanks to Memorial Art Gallery, Sarah Jesse, especially for hosting us, and Chio Yama and her event staff for their help organizing tonight's event. It's always a pleasure working with you again. And I just want to mention that tonight is not the only event happening while Mr. Gaines is in town. There's currently an exhibition of early and recent works on view now through April the 10th at University Gallery on the RIT campus. Even though it's kind of a smaller show from what you might expect from some of the recent projects Mr. Gaines has been working on, it does bring together a group of work that has not been seen together before. There are 3 contemporary works on view that have been generously loaned by Deborah Ronan, Caitlin and Ben Carricker. An etching from 1975 on loan from the Dolan Maxwell Gallery based in Philadelphia. A set of 3 lithographs from the collection of Anne Hallinan and Paul Garland. Paul's a former classmate of Charles Gaines from grad school and a fellow RIT alum. And finally, a rare large acrylic on canvas, recently restored, which is on view for the first time in over 50 years. It's worth a visit to the RIT campus for that rare occasion of seeing these works together. It was curated by Dr. Ellen Tani with assistance from Rebecca Soriano. And our thanks go out to the lenders, along with the studio of Charles Gaines and Great Lakes Art Conservation, for making this show a reality. So again, it's on view through April 10th. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Ellen if you would like to coordinate a visit. I know sometimes visiting RIT campus can be tricky. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can make that easier for you. We're happy to do that. Also, tomorrow night, another program will take place at Visual Studies Workshop, their new location at 36 King Street. A selection of films curated by Ellen Tani will include works that feature Charles Gaines, in addition to Philip Mallory Jones and Pierre Boda, whose work is currently on view in a solo show. That'll be followed by a short discussion that begins at 7 p.m. tomorrow, that program at Visual Studies Workshop. Our thanks to Ernest Davis and the staff at Visual Studies Workshop for their collaboration on that program. It's really not often that 3 major visual art sort of spaces in Rochester can collaborate on the same program, and we talk about doing it a lot. We wish we could do it more often, but it's pretty difficult to pull off, as you might imagine. But the fact that RIT, Memorial Art Gallery, and Visual Studies Workshop have all come together for this is really a testament to how versatile the work of Charles Gaines is, crossing over media formats, discourses that are relevant to all of our audiences. It's also evidence of how important Charles Gaines remains as an artist and figure in Rochester's own art and imaging history specifically, even many years after Gaines departed Rochester, receiving his MFA from RIT. Soon after grad school, Gaines embarked on a journey that led to becoming a globally recognized artist, from painting and mixed media to music and performance, kinetic sculpture, and site-specific installation. Recent solo exhibitions at the Phoenix Art Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, Hauser and Wirth, Dia Beacon, and the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, among many others, have shed new light on his extensive bodies of work. And his monumental installation, Moving Chains, drew significant attention when it was installed on Governor's Island in New York in 2022. Gaines was a longtime faculty member at Fresno State University and Cal Arts. And so at this point, Gaines has influenced generations of artists. His numerous honors include the Edward McDowell Medal, an induction into the National Academy of Design, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and recently was in Rochester just a couple of years ago to receive an honorary doctorate from RIT. And when Mr. Gaines was on campus to receive that honorary doctorate, right around that time, Dr. Ellen Tani, who's in conversation with us tonight, had just recently joined the faculty at RIT as assistant professor in art history after her own succession of postdoctoral research and curatorial fellowships, including serving as assistant curator of Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. and of course authoring many different articles and texts. But it just so happened as she appeared, she had just begun a manuscript project on Charles Gaines and was already doing extensive research into his career. And just last year, Tani received the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant in support of that project, titled Charles Gaines, Black Conceptualism and the Poetics of Systems. So I expect you'll hear some of that in tonight's conversation, which at this point has been a couple of years in the making. And so several stars in our community and beyond have aligned to make it happen. We're super grateful for that. Thankful to Dr. Tani and Charles Gaines for sharing their time here this evening, and for all of you that could be here to join us. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Please help me welcome Dr. Ellen Tani and Charles Gaines.
Thank you, John, for that introduction and also for manifesting this vision as the director of the art galleries at RIT. And thank you all for joining us on a rainy evening at a busy time of year. There are a lot of art programs happening for some reason, all in the same 3 days in Rochester. But I'm especially grateful to Charles for being here in this homecoming of sorts. It's really delightful to have you in conversation with me and to be able to walk you through this exhibition of your work today at University Gallery at RIT. Today we're going to spend some time walking through different works in the gallery space virtually here. And by way of doing that, also walking through the arc of Charles's long and ongoing artistic career. As John mentioned, Charles's practice is wide-ranging, and we won't be able to discuss every aspect of it today, but hopefully this creates an opening and a curiosity for you all to explore more. I won't dwell too much before we jump into things, but I will share some kind of brief biographical details. So, Charles was born in Charleston, South Carolina, 1944. Child of the Great Migration. Parents moved north to New Jersey, Jersey City, Newark. When you were a teenager, 8, 9, something like that. You went back and forth to Charleston and 5, yes. So sort of an early life split between the sort of northeastern United States and the South. Came to RIT for graduate school, graduated in 1967, the first African-American MFA to graduate from the School of Art at RIT, back when campus was downtown, right, I think. And went on to teach at Fresno State, embarking on a 2 decades long teaching career at Fresno State, and later to Cal Arts, where he retired emeritus in 2020, something like that. So in his retirement, he hasn't been doing anything. But making a whole lot of exciting work at a scale that I never imagined when I met you in 2012. But Charles and I have been in conversation since about then, when I approached him after a conference panel that he was on and just asked him if I could learn more about his work. And I have learned so much since then, and wanted to, foreground our conversation today by asking you a question, Charles, which is that when we look up Charles Gaines and do a bit of research on you, what we read is that you are a systems artist, who pursues conceptual practice. You really your career rose to prominence in the 1970s, making conceptually oriented work, rule-based systems, employing rule-based systems in your work. And I wanted to ask you the question, what is systems art and why does it matter to you? Before we go into the range of artworks that we'll discuss.
Well, yeah. First of all, if I start blathering, blathering is my normal public speech, But if it starts only because I was in China for 2 weeks and just came back, and so I don't know what time it is. I'm not even sure where I am. So I'm just putting that out there right now in case I, begin not to make sense, which will probably happen. But as far as this definition of systems art, in the most broad sense, I call it any art that's rule-based. And I'm not the first and hopefully not the last systems artist. You can even look at Albers as a systems artist in a certain kind of way, in the way that he used the painting as a way of exploring the visual effects of color, and using a repetitive pattern to do that. So that I even in all instances. Systems art is basically rule-based art, but it doesn't exclude subjectivity. But what it does is that it doesn't or tries to make the work not depend, its effect not depend on subjective judgment, or to make it so that your primary experience of it is the subjectivity of the artist. And so those set of principles I like, and that's why I started working rule-based. The other, which is not rule-based, but the other great influence to me was chance art. It was John Cage and also the Fluxus. Those artists that got involved in performative or performance-based work, even if it's object making, that the work is a product of the moment of making, so that the work is not dependent upon certain strategies of technical execution, or certain use of language, or even the use, or even the idea of expressing through materials one's subjectivity. So this idea of chance is a dominant feature because one would think that if one's work is based upon rules or systems, it would make predictable and boring work. And maybe it does, but what interests me is that as the maker, I don't know what's going to happen, and that phenomenon is very good because I have this idea that if one is relying on one's subjectivity in order to create and develop ideas, then one's simply going to repeat oneself because one is essentially trapped within the domain of a set of expected feelings and expectations. But if you give judgments over to like flipping a coin or some kind of chance system or a set of rules that may play out differently in the case of their assignments, then you don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's a better way to entering what I think is an important thing, to entering new and uncharted territory in the process of making art.
Thank you. And I think the role of chance is a really interesting place to start in looking at some of your earliest work, which is not what we think of when we think of Charles Gaines, which is painting. You studied painting as a graduate student at RIT. You continued painting for several years after that, and in 1973, around that point, you abandoned it. 2 years before, one of your paintings, ironically, was included in the 1975 Whitney Biennial, which is a major career highlight for any artist. And yet, at that point, you had already moved on to explorations of the grid in these rule-based systems works involving numbers. But I'll show you the work that we have included in the exhibition from this early period of Charles's career, which is this work produced sometime in the late 60s, early 1970s, last exhibited in 1972 at the University of Southern California. And we might look at a work like this and think, oh, well, this is, kind of in line with a ready-made image like the Target paintings of Jasper Johns. What about this involves chance? Like how can we understand chance, the role of chance in a painting like this? I'll note for the audience that this work is made, around the same time as in the mid-1966, the curator Lawrence Alloway curates an exhibition called Systemic Painting, trying to chart the way that abstract painters use different rule-based systems to move painting beyond the arena of gestural expression. And so I'd like to hear from you about the act of making this work, how you were experimenting with chance in a work that seems so geometric and controlled. And that will help us, I think, move into an exploration of how this maybe sets up some methods that you then explore in different medium.
This series, I guess it happened. It started being developed in the early 70s, but it actually came out of those things that we might call paintings that I was doing in graduate school. I'm not sure about that, but what was going on in those paintings was an attempt at combining different strategies of image making using the materials of paint, and putting them together. I would say using magazine layout format, but putting them together in a random and arbitrary way, and with no intention of forming meaning and so forth. So if you could just look at that as sort of a play of different kind of visual gestures that come together, I really think they're very unsuccessful paintings, but I do think that they started me thinking along the direction that I am presently. Because if we go back to the Target painting, I mentioned before that I was very much interested in chance, and so I wanted to continue that idea of random or chance relationships. And in this case, as a painter, I was dealing with that in terms of paint and materiality. So my effort to get to this idea of randomness using this format was to abandon the paintbrush and try to use other ways of applying paint to surface. And I went to geometric forms as an organizational strategy, which again comes from the other work. Just to create boundaries, to create spaces of relationships. And so they were made by taping, for example, in this piece, taping the bands, the circular bands. I tape off a circular band and then use various materials and tools to put paint, and mostly stippling and for example, I would take a rag and I would charge it with paint, and then I would just print, like kind of a printing process, just press it on the surface. And then I used an antiquing tool to drag paint and other kinds of strategies of dragging paint. Because I was working in painting, and I was dealing with the issue of color, and the way that I started to do that is to do a two-layered process where the bands are painted a solid color first, and then I would on top of that apply a second layer of color using one of these processes and strategies that I just outlined. I was able to keep the bottom color separate from the top color by using an excessive amount of a gloss medium. so that the paint would marble and float, and it wouldn't attach so much to it. And then I would peel it off the tape and mask off the painted areas and paint the exposed areas again and peel that off. And what I would discover is always a surprise. It really was trying to reduce a painting to a series of gestures, what we might call painterly gestures, but without using a paintbrush, and narrowed that investigation to the act of building an image just based upon gestures. And the bands allowed me to separate gestures rather than creating with the paint or using the paint to create form. You see, and so this gave a clearer indication of the randomness of the relationships that happened. And essentially they're abstract paintings so that you know that it's just a play of materiality.
I think that takes us into my next question. Oh, it's here. I'll show you some of these works that you made around the same time from the early 1970s. Charles's first solo exhibition in New York City was at Cinque Gallery, an alternative art space established with the focus on emerging African-American artists that were not receiving opportunities to exhibit in the art world, founded by Ernst Critchlow, Romare Bearden, and Norman Lewis. So there you are with these works in the brochure from your exhibition, and here they are outside your studio, these very large paintings. And I wanted to ask a question about your relationship to other Black artists working in abstraction in the early 1970s. You had a relationship with Romare Bearden that yielded this invitation to exhibit at Cinque. You spent time in New York City on and off in the early 1970s, spent 18 months living in New York City in 1974. And when I think about the processes you were introducing in these early works, these paintings, of finding a way of making a painting without a paintbrush, right, or using an alternative tools, I can't help but think of the way your contemporaries Jack Whitten and Ed Clark were exploring with similar strategies, right, finding alternative tools to make these abstractions, different types of gesture in their case. But I'm curious to know how you related to their work at that time when you were still making paintings.
I went during the time I was living in New York. I met Ed Clark, and Ed Clark introduced me to a number of artists, Jack Whitten being one of them. And there was this idea going on at the time having to do with making work that allowed what we call the fitness of a material to produce the form, something that we think is executed by our subjectivity, but to produce this form. And like Ed's using of the brush, the
push broom, right?
Dragging the paint across. It was, and similarly, the Jack's own abandonment of the paintbrush, and working more physically and materially with paint as if it's metal. I mean, the fact is that I knew nothing about their work until we moved to New York, and I was already discovered in a similar investigation. But I was looking at that as part of this general practice that was going on among artists in New York of testing the fitness of materiality, pushing the edges of materiality. Staying away from illusionism and so forth, and trying to deal with paint as a material, like wood or granite or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't at the time discover. There's so many parts of this. I don't even know where to begin. I didn't at the time understand what they were doing that was so uniquely different from what some of the, can we call them white artists? I don't
Sure.
know.
Yeah.
I mean, the artists who are getting all the attention because these guys got no attention, right? I didn't understand what he was doing, that they were doing was so different, or what I was doing was not according to the strategies of materiality. They called it at the time. There was a name they called this kind of strategy of making. Pardon? No. Oh, I thought somebody had the name, but anyway, what I was doing that was different from that, and so what I discovered later is that neither Ed or Jack were involved with the abandonment of representation, and in the sense that in both of their cases there was a history of materiality, or the history of the use of the material that was important to sustain within the work. And that reference to history, I think, produces a cultural language in the abstraction that I don't think any of the other artists were doing. And so what I was thinking was different from my own exploration, even though I think, and I never really talked to them specifically about it, but what was similar is this avant-garde idea to push the edges of a particular practice. In this case, for them was painting. What I think was that what I was doing that was a little different was that I was dealing with color, and they weren't. I mean, Ed was, but it was a very muted palette. And I was dealing at the time with these bright palettes, and I sort of did that on purpose because I went through a period where I decided to take the color away. There's a painting of a large abstract painting that the Oakland Museum owns.
Is it this one?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
And so I intentionally said, well, this is not going to be colorful, because I was identifying color with the history of European painting. And I thought that the way to push this is this idea, or to change the way we thought about painting, or I'll even say that take the idea of painting, put it on the shelf, the old idea of painting, and have painting be reinvented as a process, was to abandon color so that you can avoid subjective interpretation, or the essential experience that color would produce, that would create this kind of aesthetic effect that would make the painting seductively interesting. But then I realized that I was just doing that because that was what was going on in New York. They were, trying to remove, as an attempt to critique the history of painting coming out of Europe, this seductive nature of color, so that you can really deal with material, the physics of material rather than color. I mean, their mistake was that color is physics too, but they didn't look at it that way. So I reintroduced color, and that's the only thing that I thought that I think was different between what I was doing and what they were doing. But it's true. They certainly weren't influenced by me. But I wasn't influenced by them. It was something that was going on in California, and it was really to push this idea, which was a convention at the time, of finding the edges of art to try to redefine it. But what they did, which was completely remarkable, and which I can trace back to artists like Norman Lewis and Bearden, is to sustain representation, to sustain meaning, to sustain the references to culture in the production of abstract forms.
That takes us nicely into the next body of work, which is your early prints. You, of course, you had minored in printmaking at RIT and continued teaching printmaking at Fresno. We're making prints, of course, prior to this point, the work here from 1975. But you have an opportunity while you're living in New York City to be a visiting artist at the printmaker Benjamin Wigfall's kind of community art space called Communications Village. And you make 2 print editions while you're there, one of which is in the show, this large work, Untitled. And looking at that last painting, a bunch of gray-brown lines on a canvas, repetitive, laborious, actually has a really lovely resonance with this work, which is simply the repetition of the same form again and again and again. And sometimes you described your work as having a kind of critical and conceptual interest in language. And I can't help but think about writing when I look at this work and I look at the image of you making it, and what it means to sustain this endeavor that's seemingly mechanical and almost turning yourself into a kind of machine by repeating this form over and over again, but that is also exceedingly human in the irregularities and variation, that within this uniform grid of the repeated X in a square, we have all of these undulations that give a kind of vitality to this abstraction. So rather than a uniform, clean grid, we have what Wigfall wrote in the publication in which this image was originally introduced, form transforming itself into field, which I think is a really beautiful way of characterizing this work. I'm curious to hear from you about the role that this period of printmaking played in your jump from painting to more conceptual art mediums, drawing, photography, and printmaking, this shift in your practice that happens around this time. What did it mean for you to make these works?
Well, the prints that did a Ben's facility, and even the lithograph, the color lithograph I did at Fresno State. I taught printmaking, and so it's a lithograph
Back
that
to
I
that one.
produced.
Very juicy. Yeah.
The lithograph, is the extension of what I was doing in the paintings. But by the time I got to the work that I did at Ben's, as I had mentioned, I decided to abandon color. And the reason for abandoning color was to try to abandon painting. So to then make shapes with ink, or even if you're working in print medium, you have a needle to cut the etching, or in lithography, where I did do some experiments. The idea that you said about writing is so appropriate, because it seems that I wanted to keep the idea of the gesture, simplify it, not a multiple of gestures that were happening in the painting, but simplify it, a repeated gesture, and to reduce the color, and use these tools that reflect more on writing than on a gestural, the gesture produced by a paintbrush, was to get away from European painting. And the reason I wanted to get away from European painting is because the problem I had was different from the problem that a lot of the New York artists had with it, was that I thought European painting professed this idea of the significant and singular importance of subjectivity in the production of a work of art. Now, this isn't to say that subjectivity doesn't exist or that subjectivity is not important, but we had been trained to believe that a work of art is a work of art because it's the only thing you do in the world for the purpose of subjective expression. I thought that, well, if that's the case, then how do you regard the forms that you use in the process of expression? I thought the forms that you use is a language that you learn culturally. European history taught us that those forms are universal, so they're not writing, or it's not even language, but they're universal perceptual cognitive frameworks that a kind of a basic language of the universe that transcended cultures. And I thought that I wanted to show as a failed idea that the work of art is a work of art only because it's the absolute moment of pure subjective expression, by showing that it was in fact one still involved in cultural and intellectual practice as you do that. And I thought removing color was a step simply to get away from European painting and to emphasize the systematic or structural properties of the making, and to create a situation where that upon experiencing it, however you feel about or think about what you're looking at, it's something that is simply a repetitive process. It's just a pattern. That ultimately it's just a pattern, and that one can have a response to a pattern, but just ultimately what you're experiencing as a way of critiquing this idea. As I mentioned before, kind of repetitiveness that I was doing in the prints and in the painting ultimately began to bother me, because I thought that I was getting too much caught into this highly physical, material strategy of making, and I wanted to return to meaning and representation. I didn't want to return to a kind of aesthetic language that kept us engaged in some notion of a universal form, but I wanted to engage in meaning and representation. So I began to then, after doing these repetitive pieces, began to introduce color back in the work. The idea that I had was that I rather than the use of material, or what I refer to as to this fitness, does take one away from designing and shaping subjectively a work of art, a composition. But it doesn't take you away from the idea of universalisms. And so that was the problem that I was having, not being able to do that. And so I wanted to get back into some kind of framework where the cultural role, or the idea of culture, was so dominant in the work that it negated the idea that these forms that I was making were universal forms. The use of black or going away from color didn't do that. I felt that in order to get that point across, I had to work in a way where you had to work through the idea of what your convention understood as a subjective experience, a subjective sense experience. I had to work through that to a point where you know that your experience of that sense experience was really culturally produced, and not something that it was not an encounter with a universal language like my subjectivity. Mm-hmm. Just let me say one thing about this, that what I'm interpreting as the subjective experience in this whole process is that this thing that we were taught that the individual artist has a subjectivity. The viewer has a subjectivity. A successful work of art is when the viewer's subjectivity and the artist's subjectivity meet. That somehow the work of the artist's subjectivity is communicated to the viewer. And if an artist can do that, then the artist is a genius. So it was presuming that the neutral language in that was the forms that were used to create this. That was the problem I was having, because I thought such neutral forms did not exist.
Yes, the idea of dismantling this mythology about how art is produced and this relationship between the artist and the viewer becomes a crisis point for you, right? You're questioning what you learned in your education, these kind of inherited ideas around art making. And it's not just the repetitive gesture here that becomes a useful constraint, per se, in the work, but it's also the grid that emerges at this time as a kind of a compositional device of control, a set of parameters within which to kind of experiment with the creation of forms through rule-based systems. And at this point, in 1975, you start making what's known as this grid work. So work involving photography, hand-drawn grid, and hand-numbered cells within the grid. So using the grid square as another space within which to incorporate the gesture of the hand, in this case, writing numbers. This is a work, Walnut Tree Orchard, the kind of first successful conceptual series. You would argue sort of highly associated with you. I think like this is what we think of when we think of Charles Gaines, where you take a photograph of a walnut tree near where you lived in Fresno at the time. If you don't know Fresno, it's a sort of industrial agricultural basin, lots of farms, big industrial farms, and you were driving through these orchards on your way to work, back and forth, or maybe back and forth between Fresno and LA. And you write about the encounter you have with these orchards, and you realize that the orchard, I wrote it down. The orchard struck me as being machines, well-developed systems designed for one function, producing as much fruit as possible. Although they're composed of hundreds of trees, an orchard was one thing, one tree. And you explore this notion of the part to the whole in this series, which in this first iteration of Walnut Tree Orchard are 26 in the first series, every letter of the alphabet. And in the second panel of the work, the middle panel, there's a sort of contour line drawing of the form of the tree photographed. And the third panel is a hand-numbered grid squares that align with the interior form of the tree. And that kind of, that plotted form is overlaid atop the previous forms of trees in the series. And so what you get is this aggregate or composite image of the orchard itself, or the series kind of documenting its own creation. In this work, you then do the same thing with faces. I'll run through some details of this. Here's one of your colleagues from Fresno State that you photographed for this series. In this case, the photographic subject's facial contour lines are blank in this second panel of the work. We have a central axis of zeros in the middle of the work, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extending bilaterally from either side. In the third panel, the outline of the individual's facial features is overlaid atop the previous outlines of other faces in this series. Here's a detail of this guy's mustache, so where you can get a sort of closer view of what these works look like up close. We can maybe save this for the Q&A, but you discussed this work as the first time that kind of politics entered into your practice, into your work at this phase of your career. I want to run through, because we're going to run out of time if we don't. A work that emerges from this investigation that returns to color and utilizes mathematical calculations to transform one form into another. So this is the work Color Aggressions from 1980, which is included in the show. A 3-panel work where you plot geometric forms in one panel, you add the columns of each form, and then you divide that sum by a divider, and then plot again the results of that calculation to achieve these interesting transformations from hard-edged geometric forms into more organic fields of color that then as you let them expand into the space they do, not because of your choice, but because of the system of rules and calculations, start to interact in really interesting ways with one another, producing these, again, unpredictable color interactions that remind me of the way that you would make, the way that your painting process yielded unexpected color interactions, because you weren't necessarily making conscious decisions about how they would all relate to one another in the same work. This emerges from your earliest conceptual piece, regression series, where you're plotting numbers and kind of iterating them across this grid field. And then you combine this with the trees in a few interesting works here. This is a series that was exhibited at Leo Castelli Gallery. You showed with Leo Castelli and John Weber Gallery from 1980 onward, exhibiting this grid-based work for several decades at both places. And so I want to dwell on numbers and trees because at a certain point in your career, in the mid-1980s, I believe, you start kind of compressing these three-panel works into one object and bringing in color relationships to the cells that you fill in that correspond with the form of the tree. So there's an interesting continuity between the grid work that's numbers-based, where color isn't really a character so much, into this work that you continue producing. Right? This is a very recent iteration of this body of work, where color really does come to the fore again. This is a work from the Numbers and Trees Charleston series, and this emerges from this body of work, again combining photography and the kind of plotted, pixelated rendering of the form of a tree. And this is the original work from 1986, the series Numbers and Trees that you developed, that I think sold out when it was exhibited at Castelli, where we see here the accumulation of forms of the tree that produce this kind of radiant composite image, with the sort of blown up, zoomed in section of the tree rendered in the background. So I'd like to, I guess briefly, if you could share a bit about the significance of pairing numbers and trees across your body of work. That's a big question. But the tree seems to be not just a subject of representation, but a vehicle of thought through which you theorize ideas around representation in your work. I guess the basic question is, why trees?
Well, the thing is that you've given an incredible description of the narrative description of the history of the practice, and in fact, I was going to say the question is, why am I doing that, right? So, where does it come from? And it all started at RIT, actually. Yeah, because I was in a painting program, and I knew then in the program that painting wasn't for me, and so I was thinking that way, and so I said, well, I mean, why? How come I can't? Because all my friends were working in studios, smiling, having a great time. And so I said, well, let me do an anthropological study. I'll take a notepad and sneak up on and hide, and watch them, see what happens in the studio, and take notes of what happens. And maybe then I can come to love painting if I see into what they're doing. I would be able to identify with it. So I did, and I saw painters. And I saw them like sitting in a chair, and I saw an easel, and I saw them sitting there going, and and once in a while they would get up and make a mark, and they would do this kind of body thing, and they go sit down in the chair again, and so I said, I mean that was this the behavior of the painting animals, that they get up for inexplicable reasons to make marks on canvases. And so I said, I'll do that. So I went and I did that. And actually, made things that look like paintings, but then I had no identification with it. So the idea is that if you make a mark, you have a feeling that belongs to you. I had no feeling of that any of that stuff belonged to me, because I thought the whole thing was so random. So I thought it was really a kind of cognitive dissonance that was going on in my brain, that maybe I shouldn't be a painter, maybe I should be a lawyer or something like that. Cognitive dissonance. But then I thought that, well, if making a long story short, because we're out of time, that if I thought I would take that whole process of making out of the whole thing, in other words, sit down, and we didn't have computers, so it was in a notepad, created a system, and then just follow the rules of the system to make work. See how I felt about was the result. As I was mentioned before, I noticed the thing that I liked about it is that I didn't know what was going to happen in the process, and at the end, I wouldn't know until they got to the end, and at the end, I felt great exuberance. I mean, it might have been a lousy work of art, but I felt really good. I felt identify with the experience of discovery, discovery, which I never felt before because I never felt connected to the thing that I was supposed to discover subjectively. And so that's why I started working, trying to get Tantra, Fossion. I started exploring more deeply this idea of the practice, the idea of handwriting and Fossion in the left hand. I produced the idea that the left hand produces much more interesting things than the right hand if you're right-handed, because you can't control the left hand. It
has a mind of its own.
It has a mind of its own. And so I started following that. So then I had to face this other question, because doing this systems work, rule-based work, people would ask me, what does that have to do with being a black artist? Like it's too intellectual and things like that. And so I thought that was a good question. So I discovered, I created this fictional narrative that this all came from my time growing up in the South, where I was living in the Jim Crow South and living in a culture space that was controlled by a set of rules and principles, of social behavior that govern the relationship of white and black people and how they should operate. So I got curious about who put those rules into place and where they came from, And I really came to, not so much at the time, but a little later, I came to this notion that as we were told that white people were naturally more superior to black people with nature, I discovered that it's not nature at all. It's a set of rules that somebody put into place. And all we had to do is unpack and find out where those rules came from. So I extrapolated that and saying that, who put the rule into place, why subjective expression has to be the sine qua non of art. And so the work with systems was a way of unpacking this, something that we were taught to be natural, that we are natural expressors. And by using the systems, I was unpacking the history of art in the way that my sort of intellectual investigation to the history of racism unpacked the idea that racism is a construction. Race is a construction. It's not natural. This idea of the natural is really fictional. And
full of arbitrary associations, too.
Pardon?
Full of arbitrary associations, too.
So, yeah, very arbitrary. And I realized, that this is something that I just put together in my head, and maybe it's all not true, but I'm convinced that those investigations into systems and numbers and representation, it was all about finding deconstructive strategies to unpack things that are taught to be natural or true, unpack them to see where the source of that kind of idea came from. Who created it, how was it produced, and what kind of an effect will it have upon me? That if maybe I discovered that temperamentally I wasn't comfortable with being poetically expressive in the way that we were told, And so that if I'd given into that idea, I would never be happy as a painter. The reason is because I was unpacking a lot of things that I think started with some of the questions I had as a kid about Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South.
Yeah, and we've talked about this too, that you had from a very early age this kind of curious disposition where you were prone to interrogating the world around you, why things were the way they were. Why am I not a bird? You used to ask your mom, right? This is like this anecdote you shared over and over. But what I also see in the systems-based work is this effort at and a celebration of the use of a system which is a seemingly limiting device, right? Systems can be used to constrain, right? They can confine movement. They're parameters, right? They are limiting structures in a sense, but the way that you use systems is in the interest of transcendence, of how to transcend the limitation of in what you were just describing, in inherited knowledge or inherited ideas about value systems around people, around artistic practice. And so I think a beautiful like paradox that characterizes the way that systems function and operate in your work to sort of frustrate their capacity in some sense, right? You discussed how wonderful it is that logical systems can produce irrational aesthetic outcomes. And that is exciting, because that's not something that you could ever have predicted, and yet it cultivates a response in us. I think that's a good place to conclude and open to questions. I have more work to share of yours, but I want to keep in mind that our audience might be curious to learn more about other threads from our discussion. We have microphones wandering. If folks...
Oh, come on.
Let me see what I got. I got other stuff. What other stuff? Oh yeah, this is a good one. Questions? Other questions?
I don't need a microphone.
Oh, we're recording, so please use one, please, so your voice gets preserved.
I'm often told Thank you. First of all, I just want to say, is this on? Does it sound like it's on? Is it on now? Okay. It's funny because as I was listening to you, I was sharing, I had so many questions. And one question that comes to mind, I know a lot of times artists transition their practices, their inspiration and the like. And I wanted to know, I'm getting a sense of where your inspirations came from, given the time frame. And I think we stopped it. When did we stop? In the 80s? Did we make our way to the... Okay. I'm assuming that you, because once an artist, always an artist. So I'm assuming that you're still in the 2000s doing art. What inspires you to create what it is you create after, in the 1900s, 2000s? What in society? And I was told you're a drummer. Very cool. Do you incorporate music also into your art?
Yeah, on the second question, there are two bodies of work that I do. One I call the grid box, the grid works. And in the trees is it's the most common image I use in there. The other body I call the language-based work, where I use the system of language, employ rules. I use the system of language, or I have a set of rules that employs the system of language to make objects or to make installations and work. It's hard to go into that without describing what the works are. But in that body of work I do a series called the Manifestos series, where I translate music I translate letters from text into musical notes and then write an arrangement for an ensemble for that. And the arrangement, therefore, to a set of rules, comes from the text. It's not me, creating melodies. The melodies are built into the text. So if you have a series of letters, like the word tree, there's T-R-E-E. So my system says that a T and the R have to be silent beats, and the E and the E are notes. So the E note, the E note. So if you play them successively, they don't make any sense. But if you say, well, I'm going to think of these two notes as a melody, then it becomes, then it has meaning as melody. So the issue is to take this noise that's produced by the random series of letters, not change anything about them, keep the same sequence, keep the same spaces, but try to realize them as melodically within an ensemble. And the Manifesto series is based upon that. The idea is that the text produces the music, not my subjectivity.
And what's the average time frame that you actually go from your head to your hands to the canvas?
Well, I don't work with canvases anymore, but. So if we take a particular body of work, a typical grid work, which is worked in series. If I do a series of 10 pieces, it takes about a year. So it takes a month, a year. Now, each one, I have 14 people who work on my pieces. So it takes 14 people a year to produce a series of 10.
Thank you both for your talk. I wanted to ask, there was a point where you said during your talk, you talked about the idea of subjectivity and how your work has grappled with that theme over the years. There was a specific point where you mentioned that subjectivity, the subjectivity of the viewer and the creator, when those things can merge, that creates successful work. And my question for you is that throughout your career, how has the subjectivity of the audience adjusted? Has that become a hurdle, an attribute? How has the collective art viewers' interpretation of work as our language has changed, as our cultures have changed, has that impacted your work? Have you found that it hasn't impacted your work?
Okay, so remember, I criticized that definition of subjectivity, that there's this a magical coming together of the subjectivities of art, of the artist and the viewer, and I criticized that because I think that there is such a thing as subjectivity. I don't think subjectivity is the foundation for making something a work of art. So what I say is that what comes together is the experience of the artist and the experience of the audience. This creates a mise en scène, a kind of culturally based mise en scène for the production of a work of art, so that you're not what we call the magical connection. I simply think is interpretation. That we are interpretive beings. We look at something, we try to find meaning. What we bring to the thing that we're trying to find meaning is our experience and our knowledge, what we've been taught, and our temperaments. And I think that these things come together. So I never know how people are going to respond because I don't work on that level. I'm not trying to reach the subjectivity of others. I'm not even trying to reach my own subjectivity. So, but I know that I'm going to create something that produces an experience. And on a critical level, I'm hoping that the viewer understands that what they're doing when they look at my work is bringing in the history of their own experience.
Thank you so much. I had a question here. And I think that it's a good follow-up for this. And I had a question about this definition of subjectivity itself. And I guess some of what you might mean by subjectivity. Because I think that there's probably different understandings of what subjectivity might be, and I'm curious for you what the distinction is between subjectivity and experience, and life experience, for example. And then I think others, might think of subjectivity as something systematically produced as well, like a capital S subjectivity that arises from a system, and as like a system of, like you were saying, white supremacy as well, that produces subjectivities. But I think that there's different levels and like valences that you're using subjectivity, and I'd just be curious to hear more about that.
Talking about this application in works of art, how we consider those things as part of that art production. The concept is one that's been developed by psychology. Right? And I think it is a property of being human, and I think it's exercised in every moment of our awake state. But where I think is that in ordinary life, you know that your subjectivity operates within the context of your cultural experience. Now, the idea of art that's been taught is that it can operate outside your cultural experience, and that I don't believe. So what I'm saying is that rather than saying the aesthetic effect, it's so much complicated, that there are two things happen. One is an aesthetic effect that you learn in a work of art, and then maybe you can find meaning in that effect. But even the meaning is not so important in terms of the way we've been taught about the work of art. But what I'm saying is that the aesthetic, what we call the aesthetic effect, is actually an interpretational process of both our senses and our intellect. It involves both. They can't be separated. I think that the idea that there is an autonomous construct of a subjectivity, like I have a subjectivity, I mean, it's a myth. I mean, I've never seen my subjectivity. I mean, the whole thing is that it's supposed to be produced by evidence. So, like, if I just jumped up and down on the stage gyrating, you would say, "Oh, suddenly I've lost my mind." But I would say, "Well, no, maybe I was just being subjective." But the fact that I lost my mind would be true, because what you're saying is not a subjectivity, but you're saying something that's produced visually and experientially, and you're calling it subjectivity. You're saying that its source is somewhere buried in the person. All right, so the concept is as complicated as you're saying, subjectivity. It is complicated. But with respect to works of art, what I'm saying is that if you think about how it works in ordinary life, your subjectivity, it works the same way in a work of art. And if you try to say, well, I can, express my subjectivity, by gyrating on the stage, if you see that in your ordinary life, you say the person's out of their minds. And I say that if any claim that in a work of art that's what's going on, I say that person's out of their minds. So that in fact, that's the subjectivity that happens in ordinary life. You should use the same definition of subjectivity in works of art, which is a combination of our experiential and sensory and intellectual faculties, all working in unison. You can't separate one from the other.
Hello. I just wanted to, I really appreciated something you mentioned earlier, a question you're always faced with, and that's being asked by yourself or by others, how does my final product relate or connect back to being Black? And I just wanted, because that's something like I've asked myself before going into an artwork, if I want to talk about my Black experience or just my experience as a whole. And I just wanted to know, like, what did it take for you to realize that it doesn't, others don't have to understand how it connects back to your identity, whether it was like just something you realize yourself or if someone else had to give you that wisdom.
Well, the idea of expressing first of all, we shouldn't expect black people to be more. We shouldn't expect them to work that deals with what we call the black experience, any more than white people dealing with work that's called the white experience, because the whole framing is part of a Manichaean dichotomy. Right, but if you do work that's based upon a concept of experience that is blackness, I think that's, it couldn't be better. I mean, I'm saying that there isn't any kind of work you shouldn't be doing. What I caution is to make sure that work, how can I put it, that work is not dealing with certain stereotypes or certain sort of expected forms of representation or certain anticipations we might, or certain definitions that we might have, that your question about being black isn't ended by your work. It's been made even more intense. It raises more questions about being black than being an answer to being black, or in terms of this. And that's the one thing that I think. And so there are many artists who deal with identity-based work that I think don't challenge the question of identity in the work. And I have problems with that. The idea of doing that, I couldn't champion more. In fact, the big question that I had when I was younger was, you're a black artist, why are you doing the systems work? That's white art. All right, and my answer, didn't satisfy them. But my whole narrative about my experience in the Jim Crow South, it means that my interest in intellectual practices came from my experience as a black person.
I just put up on the screen one of your Faces Identity Politics works, which I think is a good example of what you're describing, of exploring the intellectual history of identity, right, as a concept. In this body of work, you took the faces of 10 authors whose theories have informed identity politics important to you, and layered them in this numbers grid-based mode that you were previously using to plot trees. So putting that intellectual history into a space of representation.
When you look at someone like Jackson Pollock, someone might look at something like that and say, oh, there's no rules. But it seems like what you're saying is actually there are rules that he was using to make his art. And so in your work, instead of pretending that there's no rules, you're making your rules explicit. So am I right about that? That's question number one. And then question number two is, are there rules that determine your rules, like meta rules, so to speak?
Well, the first thing about Pollock, I totally agree with. The issue is that at the time, he tried to create a space of production that was, for a work of art that was new. He was trying to do that. All right, and so I give him credit for that. It's not like that he was championing this whole idea of self-expression, because he was himself trying to critique that idea of self-expression by this kind of complex overproduction, this hyperbole of production, and regarding your second question. It doesn't seem like, but the interesting thing what I find interesting about the application of rules in a productive process is that it turns out that it produces random relationships. The rules are not instrumental. They create aporias or dysporias. What's the word? I can't remember. But they create these indeterminacies in rules, and the way we think about, I think the way we think about rules is that, it's like law, like, I can't rob a bank, and so it's very instrumental that way. But what I find interesting is the fact that people, the rules create the space where you can break them, where you can create a context for, which thinking of Rauschenberg that way, that you can recognize limits and try to get beyond them. These spaces of the unknown, rules do that. Otherwise, without them, there wouldn't be no such thing as the unknown. So it emphasizes that more than it emphasizes the kind of instrumental ordering.
Thank you both for your talk. It's really great. I look at your work and I hear you talk about, it seems like to be about like this celebration of the investigation of just life and how much that there is. And with that investigation, do you ever get overwhelmed? That's my first question. That there's so much investigation and so much you're talking about and so much you're thinking about with just like the humanities, like that's so much. And then with that, if you do your formulas of creating and thinking about like this entire investigation, do they help you with that if you get overwhelmed? That's my two questions.
That's a very interesting question. I think that the thing that keeps me from, well, first of all, let me say that that the way that I work, where I set up a set of rules for production. When things are in play, they suggest other things. And if you go down that path, those paths suggest more stuff. And it's possible that because of what's constantly being suggested as permutations of a set of ideas, it can be overwhelming. I think the thing that keeps it from being is the rigor of the work's production. I just can't do them all. I just can't get to it. There's no possibility, and I'm fine with that because of the difficulty of the making process in what we do. It keeps me busy enough not to say I got to do this, I got to do that, I got to do that. I just came from China and they were developing a new idea. And while on this trip, I must have had 100 things that I wanted to do, but I can't do them all, right? So I don't allow myself the idea that it has to be, these things have to be done. If I thought of it, then it has to be done. And from getting away from that kind of thinking, and keeping a certain level of pragmatics of production in play, I keep that sense of being overwhelmed at bay. Yeah.
I think we're near the end of our time. Do we have time for one more?
We have a person down here who's been dying.
Yeah, let's have one last question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, it's always wonderful to have a relationship between an artist to get a mindset. And I noticed that your age and your mind is youthful. And I think that's wonderful. Do you see any implication about your artwork helping people that are elderly? There's a program out where you take a brush and you go over it and the colors appear. It's layer on layer kind of thing. And I get that feeling that there's some hope with your artwork for elderly who are experiencing difficulty with their mental in various places. The other thing, one of your pieces on the fabric, you're etching. Do you recall what your mindset was as you were etching that piece?
The first question, I'd have to be, a clinician to be able to. Yeah. On the first question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, my mic. I wasn't talking to my mic. Yeah. So the first question, I'd have to be a clinician. I mean, I would like to think that the work could have that use. I'd have to be a clinician to be able to know that for sure. But the idea of it, I think, is, that there's certain things that if you do it, you keep your mind occupied. As you get older, it can keep your mind active and keep your mind nimble. And like music is definitely one of those things. So I think on a certain level, what you're saying is possible. I just don't know how to apply it. On the second part, that I'm not thinking anything when I'm making the work, because the making of it is more meditative experience. I'm not trying to work out anything because the rules is telling me what to do. And so I find myself in, I have a team that does it now, but back when I was doing it, I found myself, something more akin to a meditative space.
The arts reflect social, emotional, political events during our lifetime. And one of your artwork going laterally and the color changing from darkness to light, I found very interesting. Was there any social, political mindset when you did that?
The way politics, the politics in the grid work is more obscure, not as present as the politics in the language-based work. Because in the language-based work, I'm dealing with political documents. And so you can, because there's a political context always at play in the language-based work. The grid work, I think, is also political, but my notion of politics may be different, rather than the politics being about a number of political ideas of subjects like human rights and the treatment of people. The politics is about has to do with trying to unpack ideology, try to unpack the idea, unpack how we could be told things and be told that these things are true, when in fact they're constructions and serving, interests that were probably not my own.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you all for joining us tonight.